The press like to give killers labels, and especially Ripper. Jack the Ripper and the Yorkshire Ripper are the most enduring. But one of the most gruesome thrived in the shadows of war. He was the Blackout Ripper. The Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard dates back to 1874 and houses artifacts and evidence collected over 2 centuries of crime. Many of the exhibits have made history, furthering developments in forensic science or cornering some of Britain's most notorious criminals. These items have rarely been touched, many have never been seen since they made their journey from courtroom to crime museum. There's early fingerprint evidence, blood typing, DNA advancements, and an arsenal of guns, knives, and poisons. There's always an urgency to find a serial killer, because they often go on killing till they're caught. This film reopens one casebook, and locked away in the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard are the macabre mementos. A catalogue of items that he stole from his victims, clothing that he removed from them, and grisly instruments that he used on them to horrific effect. The term Ripper has been used a lot, but there's only one case in British legal history where the label is literally right. The distractions and the darkness of the Blitz in London in 1942 was the ideal opportunity. In 1942, nighttime London was besieged by Hitler's air force. The capital was cloaked in darkness to prevent the bombers spotting targets. But the city was seething with life, including servicemen in training or on leave. In time of total war, knowing their chances of survival might be slim, they were determined to enjoy their stay in London to the full. But out of the ranks of these potential war heroes came a man for whom life was not precious at all. Nothing like him had been seen since Jack the Ripper.
Blackout was imposed because of we were being heavily bombed by the Germans. Windows inside houses had black curtains on them so no light can go through. In certain places you weren't even allowed to smoke because of the red glow. There's not many alarms going because of the electricity restrictions. It was a thieves' paradise.
Throughout the Blitz, the blackout was rigidly enforced and every Londoner obliged. Total darkness was their best protection. Or so it seemed.
On the morning of the 9th of February, 1942, in daylight, the body of a lady was found face down in a bomb shelter in the West End of London.
The woman was Evelyn Hamilton. She worked as a manageress at a chemist's in Essex. It seemed she'd been accosted and killed on the darkened streets before her body had been abandoned in an air raid shelter in Soho. Missing was her handbag, and with it, £80.
An examination of the body revealed that she'd been strangled. Her scarf had been put into her mouth and used as a gag.
The following day, Tuesday, February the 10th, another body was found, a mile away from the first. This victim was Evelyn Oatley, a 35-year-old former chorus girl. When her stage career declined, Evelyn had resorted to prostitution, working from a small flat in Soho.
The body had been mutilated and was found in her bed. Chief Superintendent Fred Cherrell attended the scene. found fingerprint evidence, and it now started to produce a bit of a pattern. He was able to say at this stage that due to the amount of pressure that has been used on the windpipes, that the person that committed these offences were left-handed.
Both women showed evidence of bruising on the right side of their throats. But more shocking was mutilation. Evelyn Oatley's abdomen and lower torso had been cut open. Next to her body was this blood-stained can opener. The tin opener was passed to Chief Superintendent Fred Cherrell for examination, and immediately he spotted a faint fingerprint.
It would appear that our suspect was doing a murder per night. The third one was discovered on the 12th, but she'd been missing for more than 2 days. Her husband didn't even know that she was a prostitute, and when he returned, he found her body, again, badly mutilated. She had been seen with a man in uniform returning to her flat.
The third body, that of Margaret Lowe, was found in her house, half a mile from the body of Evelyn Oatley. There was little evidence of a struggle, and her clothes lay where she'd thrown them.
When the police arrived at the premises to examine the body, they pulled back the bedclothes. She was naked from the waist down, and it showed that she'd been very badly mutilated.
When Cherrell arrived at the scene, he found the killer had done little to cover his tracks. These knives were left there, fingerprints were found, and again, the killer was left-handed. But this time, a witness emerged who'd spotted a uniformed man escorting Margaret Lowe the night before. By now, Cherrell realised there was a new Ripper on the loose. Even the case-hardened pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, said the injuries were quite dreadful and that the perpetrator was a savage maniac. As Cherrell left the crime scene, he got word that the killer had struck yet again.
The fourth lady, Doris Journay, was discovered having been missing for a couple of days. She was married to a French waiter. Her husband, again, did not know that she was a prostitute. When he got into the house, he found that the door to the bedroom was barricaded from the inside. He called the police. Again, it was a very badly mutilated body.
Doris Journay had been slashed savagely with a razor blade. Her body was clad only in her dressing gown, and she was sprawled across her bed. By now, the press had come up with the headline, Blackout Ripper, and warnings went out especially to prostitutes in Soho. But for most of them, like the Blitz itself, this was just another nightly hazard.
People turn into prostitution do it for different reasons. I think at this stage, it literally was money that they needed. I said there's not much work out there. They've got to find a way of living. There's no social security. And they had to bring money into the house.
4 women had been murdered in 5 days, 3 of whom were prostitutes. They'd been strangled with these stockings and then mutilated with these instruments. But what was driving the killer to such brutality?
Each of these scenes, you could see that the handbags of the ladies had all been emptied out and items had been stolen. So whether it was just greed, whether it was robberies that had gone wrong and he wanted to deal with some sort of hatred towards the ladies at that time, we just don't know.
These murders would be huge news in peacetime, and even in the midst of a world war, they sent shockwaves through London's West End. Fred Cherrell reported, As women passed through the lightless streets at night, they wondered whether the murderer might be lurking. February 1942, the height of the Blitz on London. The city is under siege. The last thing Londoners need is something else to worry about, but they do. A Ripper is on the loose. This is the scene. It's a shop doorway off Piccadilly at the height of the blackout. And it would be in a doorway that the Blackout Ripper would strike again. This is the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard. It's home to the world's largest collection of crime scene artefacts. In fact, only a select few have ever viewed these intriguing and sometimes rather grisly objects. But now, with exclusive access, we can show you some of the secrets within. It's London, February 1942, and the city is in total darkness at the height of the Blitz. 4 women, 3 of whom were prostitutes, had been found dead over the course of 5 days, all killed in the blackout. From the way the victims had been strangled, the senior detective, Fred Cherrell of Scotland Yard, was sure the killer was left-handed. He had fingerprints too, but all he knew about the killer was that he wore a uniform. His victims' bodies had all been found in a small area around London's Soho. They'd all been robbed, then strangled with these their own stockings. They'd all been mutilated with these knives and other instruments.
Examination of the scenes revealed that the cuts to the body were very deep, done with venom. The knives were plunged into the body. Indeed, I would say a lot of hatred by the person that did them.
Unbelievably savage as these attacks had been, even if the killer had been soaked in blood, the blackout would have been his friend. For who would have noticed bloodstains in almost total darkness? These are the knives that the Blackout Ripper used to mutilate his 3rd victim, Margaret Lowe.
Whether it's done before death or after death, we cannot say.
On the evening of Thursday, February the 12th, the same day as both Doris Journet and Margaret Lowe had been murdered, another unsuspecting young woman made her way through the streets of London's West End.
Our suspect had met our victim in the Trocadero in Piccadilly. She was there to meet a serviceman for a date. The serviceman never showed up. Our suspect then approached her and said, "Well, can I take you for a drink?" Having gone for a drink, she felt uncomfortable in his company.
There was something wrong about him?
There was something wrong, something she didn't like. Said goodbye, and out she went. But he followed her along St Albans Street. And when they came to here, to the shop doorway, he grabbed her by the throat and tried to kill her.
With his bare hands?
With his bare hands. Being a serviceman, he had a government-issue gas mask. He had that with him. He put it down to keep his hands free and went for her neck. And as he throttled her, she's near to collapse. And at that particular time, a young lad, a delivery boy, came along, saw there was something happening in the doorway. Again, because of the blackout, his vision's going to be restricted. He called out, "What are you doing there?" Our suspect ran off, leaving his gas mask at the scene.
Within minutes, the police had sealed off the scene of the attack, and in the doorway they found the woman's empty handbag and her attacker's gas mask.
Having got away, he then went for his 2nd attack of that night. He got to know this prostitute and asked for services, and they were going back to her home address. When they got back to the house, as they got to the door of the house, there was an interruption in the electricity flow, and the lights went dead.
This is lights in, because a blackout outside, so now gone black inside as well.
Now totally blackout inside there, and at that particular time, he went for her. So he's now trying to strangle her. But she was stronger than what he anticipated, and she put up a good fight and screamed out for help. He panicked. During the struggle, his belt had come off, and he left that at the scene, and he ran out.
He'd moved from one attack to the next, as though in the grip of some compulsion. But in his frantic haste, he left 2 vital clues behind, clues as good as a signature. Now, his gas mask presumably could identify him, because each gas mask was issued to an individual, particularly in the armed services.
And inside that, they had to mark it up, all their property. All their uniform had to have their name on it, because there was so much uniform, of course, and couldn't lose it. And so, yes, his gas mask had to have his service number on it, and his gas mask was no different. His number was on that gas mask.
It was stamped with the Cadets Air Force number 525987. And the belt that he dropped at the scene of the second attack confirmed the same identity.
At the second scene, he dropped his webbing belt. So you've now got his uniform and you've got his service number. Inquiries were done through the RAF, and the service number was matched up to Gordon Frederick Cummins, a trainee fighter pilot based at St John's Wood.
Police arrested Gordon Cummins at his military accommodation. He was placed on an identity parade. But would the 2 women who'd been attacked that night identify him as their assailant?
The first one, Greta Hayward, because she spent that amount of time with him, she was able to say, yes, that's the man that attacked me. The second one, all she could actually really identify was his piercing blue eyes and the fact that he was wearing a uniform.
So they had enough at this stage to charge him with 2 attempted murders, presumably. They had a partial identification from one of the victims, they had a full identification from another, they had his webbing, his belt at one address, they had his gas mask at another. That's pretty good stuff.
He denied all involvement in these offences.
Gordon Frederick Cummins was charged with the murder of Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowes and Doris Journet, and with the attempted murder of Greta Hayward and Mrs. Mulcahy. Cummins claimed he'd been alone in his hostel all that night, and police needed more hard evidence. They went back to his accommodation, this time for a thorough search, and went through his belongings, including his uniform and locker.
Here, we got a cigarette case and cigarettes of Evelyn Hamilton.
The first victim?
The first victim. Now that was found inside the pocket of his uniform, so it's actually on Cummins.
These cigarettes and the cigarette case were stolen from Evelyn Hamilton's handbag after he left her dead. The search quickly turned up other damning evidence. In fact, more than the police could have dreamt of. A catalogue of exhibits and more than enough to clinch the case.
Also there, they found a watch. Now, that watch belonged to Doris Journet, positively identified, because she had a problem with her skin. She couldn't have metal close to it. So she got a piece of plaster, sticking plaster, and cut a square out and put that on the back of the watch and attached and started wearing the watch. At the home address, they found a plaster from which she cut out the square, positively identifying that watch.
And tell us about all these things. There's a can opener, the knives.
These are all weapons that we use at the time of killing our victims. We start with the stockings. These are stockings from the victim. You can actually see at that time with shortages, there's holes being darned in the stockings to save money and materials. These were used to strangle our victims.
It was almost as though the killer didn't worry about being caught. He seemed unfazed about leaving clues behind. Not just his distinctive behavior, the strangulation and the mutilation, but the knives, and most conclusively of all, his fingerprints. The evidence was overwhelming. Detective Chief Superintendent Cherrell could not have asked for more. The pressure points around the victims' necks proved the murderer, like Cummins, was left-handed. And the fingerprints on the can opener and knives were a perfect match to those of Gordon Cummins. Even so, when he came for trial at the Old Bailey, Cummins pleaded not guilty to all charges.
The evidence against him was overwhelming.
How long, when it came to court, did it take the jury to decide he was guilty?
35 minutes.
Wow.
That's all it was. And he was executed on the 25th of June, 1942.
The Blackout Ripper, Gordon Cummins, spent his final months in the condemned cell at Wandsworth Prison in South London and never accepted his guilt. To prison officers, to family or friends who came to visit. Maybe he really was out of touch with reality. He claimed he was a victim of a miscarriage of justice right up to the moment of his death. There's no question about the identity of this Ripper. Gordon Cummins had used the darkness of the Blitz to his advantage, and it was with savage irony that he was hanged at Wandsworth Prison in the middle of an air raid. Even when faced with the overwhelming evidence and the jury's guilty verdict, Gordon Cummins pleaded his innocence all the way to the gallows. I gather, amazingly, he was married and his wife absolutely refused to believe any of this and stuck by him.
She always stuck by him, even up to the late 80s. She was actually met by a colleague of mine, and even then she insisted that her husband was not guilty of those offences.
For 130 years, the Crime Museum at New Scotland Yard has been archiving the tools, the relics and the instruments of the most notorious murderers, most infamous conmen, most audacious of thieves. Nowadays, it's a training ground for the police and the judiciary, but it's also a sombre reminder of humanity's capacity for evil and a tribute to the triumphs of Scotland Yard.
The guns and masks used by the cop killers Fred Brown and Pat Kennedy are seen for the first time since the trial next as we return to Secrets of the Crime Museum.